Around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, emerged in Africa. This continent was the cradle of all humankind. However, for most of their early history, humans lived and developed only within this single continent. It would take over 100,000 years before the first groups attempted to leave their ancestral homeland, to step into the unknown and never return. The earliest recorded waves of migration out of Africa occurred between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago. These were not massive exoduses, as we often imagine. Instead, they were small, scattered groups, following rivers and desert edges, slowly crossing narrow corridors near the Red Sea or moving into the Middle East. But nearly all of these early migrations failed. The first humans who left Africa vanished from the modern genetic record. They left no descendants. No traces of their DNA exist in any living human population today. They were cut off from the main branch of human history. Why did they fail? Archaeological evidence from the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Levant reveals intermittent appearances of Homo sapiens. Blade-like stone tools, campfire remains, and human bones appear in layers, then disappear. There is no long-term continuity. Temporary settlements show that these groups once lived, hunted, and formed early communities, only to vanish without a trace. Many of these sites lie on fragile ecological corridors, easily erased when environmental conditions changed. Global climate was a decisive factor. Prolonged glacial periods turned the Middle East and northeastern Africa into arid, rapidly desertifying regions. When the water retreated, life disappeared. Ecosystems collapsed, hunting failed, vegetation withered. Humans lacked food, shelter, and safety, and were forced to abandon new lands or perish. At that time, Homo sapiens were still deeply dependent on nature. They had no agriculture, no metal tools, no maps, no compasses, no historical memory to learn from past mistakes. Their survival relied entirely on hunting, gathering, and following seasonal cycles, tracking animal herds, and searching for water. Without a supportive ecosystem, they could not survive. There is no evidence that the first humans who left Africa had any grand plan or long-term vision. There were no nations, no goal of permanent settlement. They moved by instinct, like herds of antelope seeking new grasslands when the savanna dried up. And yet, what's remarkable is this: despite repeated failure, humans kept moving, not just once, but again and again over tens of thousands of years. This wasn't cultural curiosity, nor was it driven by population pressure. At that time, the entire human population may have been only a few tens of thousands across all of Africa. So why did they keep going? The most likely explanation is environmental pressure. Drastic climate shifts repeatedly reshape Africa's ecosystems. Cycles of warming and cooling transformed fertile lands into deserts and deserts back into grasslands. During dry periods, small human groups were forced to move, in search of water, food, and safer ground. Not moving could mean death. Some groups followed migrating animals north, crossing the Sinai Desert into the Middle East. Others hugged the Red Sea coast and entered the Arabian Peninsula. A few tried crossing the mountainous forests that today form parts of Ethiopia and Sudan. But the risks were high. Predators, unfamiliar diseases, and harsh climates pushed many to the edge of extinction. Still, the migrations continued. This persistence reveals an ancient instinct. When faced with ecological collapse, Homo sapiens did not wait. They moved. They gambled. And this act, simple, repeated over tens of thousands of years, planted the seeds of survival. Not all perished. Some groups survived. Some left faint traces, like a fragment of bone in a cave in Israel or a flint tool on a Red Sea terrace. These are the footprints of early experiments, the first risky steps out of Africa, ending either in extinction or laying the groundwork for something greater. That journey did not begin with ambition. It did not begin with culture. It began with biological desperation, not with curiosity, not with dreams, but because there was no other choice. They had to go, and in the end, one group went far enough to write the rest of human history. Part 2. The Successful Wave. 70,000 years ago. Roughly 70,000 years ago, a turning point occurred in the history of Homo sapiens. After hundreds of thousands of years confined to Africa, a small group managed to leave the continent, and this time, they did not vanish. This migration was different. It was not just another failed attempt. It marked the first successful and lasting wave of human expansion beyond Africa. Global context. The success of this migration was not random. It was driven by a specific set of environmental and ecological conditions. Around this period, the planet entered a brief climatic window between glacial extremes. This temporary climatic stability allowed for the growth of key ecosystems across parts of the Middle East and South Asia, making regions beyond Africa more habitable, at least for a time. In East Africa, however, the situation was deteriorating. The region was undergoing ecological stress, droughts, declining rainfall, collapsing lakes, and the shrinking of savanna habitats. The animals that Homo sapiens depended on, large herbivores like antelope, gazelle, and buffalo, were moving away or dying out. The pressure to leave was no longer optional. It was necessary. The migration route. The successful group moved out through what is now the Horn of Africa, crossing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a narrow waterway connecting the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. At that time, sea levels were lower, possibly revealing exposed land or reducing the crossing to a few kilometers. From there, they spread across the Arabian Peninsula, then into South Asia, Southeast Asia, and ultimately reached Australia by about 65,000 years ago. This path is supported by archaeological evidence found across the route. Stone tools in Arabia, dated to around 70,000 years. Molecular data indicating ancient genetic splits in Asian populations. Human fossils and cultural remains in northern Australia, firmly dated to at least 65,000 years ago. This rapid movement across vast distances suggests that the early migrants were not wandering aimlessly. They had the skills, knowledge, and coordination needed to track resources, adapt to new environments, and survive long-term. Technological and social advancements. What made this wave succeed where others had failed? First, they carried with them an improved set of tools. The stone technology was more refined, with microliths, composite tools, and cutting edges that allowed greater versatility. These tools weren't just for hunting. They were used for making clothing, processing food, and building shelters. Second, they utilized fire strategically. Fire was no longer just warmth or protection. It was integrated into their camp structures, used in cooking to unlock more calories from food, and may have been used to manage landscapes by controlled burning. Third, they hunted in coordinated groups, using tactics that required communication, planning, and role assignment. This was not opportunistic scavenging, it was organized subsistence. But perhaps most importantly, this group had developed a new way of thinking, cognitive edge. The successful migrants demonstrated behaviors that suggest abstract thinking and symbolic communication. They lived in larger, more complex groups than their predecessors. They likely used nonverbal systems, marks, objects, gestures, to transmit information and instructions. There is growing evidence of early symbolic objects, pierced shells, ochre pigments, decorated tools, not just functional, but possibly communicative. These are not just signs of culture, they're signs of cognition. They suggest the ability to mentally project into the future, to anticipate threats, plan food storage, or prepare for seasonal changes. This capacity to imagine and plan is a defining trait. It transformed Homo sapiens from a reactive species into a strategic one. Scaling the planet. Once this cognitive shift took hold, the limits of geography began to break down. Within only a few thousand years, these early humans reached across subcontinental Asia, traversed dense jungles, survived mountainous terrain, and made their way through island chains to reach the coasts of Australia. This required more than land travel. It may have involved early seafaring. Simple rafts or dugout canoes would have been enough to cross narrow ocean channels, but the leap required imagination, engineering, and collective effort. By this point, Homo sapiens was not simply surviving, it was expanding, occupying diverse ecosystems, establishing cultural memory, adapting to threats before they occurred. Lead in to next chapter. But they were not alone. The planet was not empty. Ahead of them, across Eurasia and deep into the mountains of Southeast Asia, lived other humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps others yet unknown. These weren't apes, they were human, intelligent, adapted, and they had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. What happened when Homo sapiens encountered these ancient cousins would shape the destiny of our species. Part 3. A historic encounter. Neanderthals and Denisovans. As Homo sapiens expanded beyond Africa around 70,000 years ago, they entered territories that were not uninhabited. Across Eurasia, two other human species had already lived for hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals in the west and Denisovans in the east. These were not primitive ancestors. They were fully human, adapted to their environments, and had built their own evolutionary legacy long before Homo sapiens arrived. Established populations. Neanderthals had been living across Europe and parts of Western Asia for over 400,000 years. Fossil records, stone tools, and burial sites confirm their long-term presence in regions from Spain to Siberia. Denisovans, a more recently discovered lineage, occupied regions across Central and Eastern Asia. Though we lack complete skeletons, genetic material extracted from bones and teeth found in the Denisova cave in Siberia reveals a distinct human species that had diverged from Neanderthals over 400,000 years ago and from Homo sapiens even earlier. These were not accidental wanderers. They were established, adapted, and regionally dominant species. Their survival across glacial cycles proves their resilience. When Homo sapiens arrived, they were entering an inhabited world, contact and interbreeding. The interaction between Homo sapiens and these other species was not limited to competition. Genetic evidence reveals that interbreeding occurred, and the outcomes of those encounters have left a permanent legacy in the DNA of modern humans. Today, all non-African humans carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Populations in Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, and parts of East Asia carry an additional up to 5% Denisovan DNA. This genetic legacy is not symbolic, it has biological consequences. Functional inheritance. Some of the Neanderthal-derived genes found in modern humans are linked to immune system function, skin and hair traits, and response to cold environments. These traits were likely beneficial for early Homo sapiens entering the colder climates of Europe and Central Asia. In contrast, Denisovan genes provided adaptations that are still present today in certain populations. A notable example is the EPAS1 gene variant found in Tibetans, which allows efficient oxygen use at high altitudes, a trait directly inherited from Denisovans. Interbreeding, therefore, was not a rare or marginal event. It was a selective exchange, an evolutionary shortcut that allowed Homo sapiens to absorb regionally beneficial traits from more ancient, localized populations. Modes of encounter. The precise nature of these interactions is still debated. Encounters may have ranged from peaceful cohabitation, tool exchange, and cultural learning, to conflict, territorial disputes, and violent confrontations. Archaeological records show overlapping habitation layers, with signs of similar tool types in certain regions, such as the Levallois technique, which appears in both Neanderthal and Homo sapien sites. This suggests either parallel development or knowledge transfer. At the same time, trauma marks on skeletal remains and rapid shifts in settlement patterns imply that some contacts may have been hostile or marked by resource competition. Who learned from whom? One of the central questions in paleoanthropology is whether Homo sapiens learned from Neanderthals and Denisovans, or vice versa. Neanderthals developed complex tools, controlled fire, hunted large game, and likely had symbolic behavior, as suggested by possible burial rituals and use of ochre. Denisovans, while less understood, are linked to advanced genetic diversity and regional adaptation. Yet Homo sapiens demonstrated a key advantage: flexibility. Unlike Neanderthals, whose tools remained relatively stable over long periods, Homo sapiens modified their technologies rapidly. They adjusted toolkits depending on the environment, experimented with materials, and improved efficiency. More importantly, Homo sapiens expanded networks of information, using objects and symbolic markings to share knowledge across generations and between groups. This led to faster learning curves and broader adaptability. In other words, while Neanderthals may have had deeper local knowledge, Homo sapiens were better at connecting ideas, transferring information, and evolving in real time. Coexistence, then disappearance. For several thousand years, multiple human species coexisted. There were regions where Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans may have all been present at overlapping times. They ate similar foods, occupied similar shelters, and used similar tools. But then, the pattern shifted. Gradually, Neanderthals disappeared from Western Eurasia, vanishing from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans, too, seem to have dwindled in presence, eventually surviving only in traces within the DNA of modern humans in Southeast Asia. There was no single extinction event. Instead, it was a process, slow, regionally variable, and likely driven by a combination of interbreeding, environmental pressure, and loss of reproductive isolation. As Homo sapiens expanded, other species declined, not because they were weaker, but because Homo sapiens absorbed them, genetically, behaviorally, ecologically. Lead into next chapter. The meeting of Homo sapiens with Neanderthals and Denisovans was not a battle of superior intellects. It was an evolutionary crossroad, one marked by exchange, contact, and gradual merging. But in the end, only one lineage continued, ours. What gave Homo sapiens the long-term advantage? To understand that, we must explore not just the tools and genes, but the strategies of survival, organization, and foresight that made our species the last one standing. Part 4. The Reason We Survived. Why Only We Remain. By 40,000 years ago, multiple human species had shared the Earth for over 100 millennia. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, Homo naledi in Africa, and Homo sapiens, our species, emerging from Africa and spreading rapidly. But by 10,000 years ago, only one remained. The question is not just what happened to them, but rather, why did we survive? Population scale and social network size. One of the clearest differences was population structure. Homo sapiens lived in larger and more interconnected groups. Genetic studies suggest that Neanderthals, for example, lived in small, isolated populations, many of which showed signs of inbreeding and genetic bottlenecks. This made them more vulnerable to environmental shocks, disease, and demographic collapse. In contrast, Homo sapiens organized themselves in wider social networks. Even if individual bands were small, they were connected to others through systems of exchange, of tools, knowledge, mates, and resources. These networks buffered local catastrophes and allowed cultural innovations to spread rapidly. A wider network meant greater resilience, and greater resilience meant greater long-term survival, abstract thought, and symbolic communication. Another major distinction lies in the mind. Homo sapiens developed a capacity for abstract thinking far beyond anything seen in other human species. We created symbols, rituals, and stories. Tools not for survival in the physical sense, but for social cohesion. We painted images of animals and spirits deep in caves. We buried our dead with tools, beads, or ochre. We carved figurines, wore jewelry, and decorated our bodies. These were not random acts. They were structured expressions of meaning, enabling the formation of shared beliefs and collective identity. This symbolic behavior allowed humans to build cooperation beyond kinship. When two individuals believed in the same story, symbol, or ancestor, they could trust each other, coordinate, and collaborate, even if they had never met before. Such trust created larger, more complex social units and reinforced loyalty, memory, and motivation across generations. Flexible technology and environmental adaptation. Homo sapiens also demonstrated a superior ability to modify tools based on context. While Neanderthal tools remained relatively static, Homo sapiens developed tools that varied by region, season, and purpose. We see rapid innovations: blades, bone needles, microliths, and composite tools. Materials adapted to local conditions: obsidian, flint, quartzite, bone, resin, fishing gear, nets, snares, and watercraft, evidence of diversified subsistence strategies. Instead of relying on a single toolkit across all environments, Homo sapiens demonstrated a modular approach, retooling methods depending on resource availability. This technological agility allowed them to survive in deserts, tundras, coastal zones, jungles, and high mountains, ecosystems that would have overwhelmed more rigid species. Dynamic social organization. Beyond tools and symbols, Homo sapiens created fluid social systems. Where other species may have formed static family units, sapiens could split and rejoin, form alliances, and restructure leadership based on circumstances. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests bands could merge temporarily for large hunts or rituals. Knowledge was transmitted through oral tradition, songs, and stories. Decision-making could shift depending on age, experience, or need. This flexibility enabled humans to navigate population loss, migration, and conflict more effectively than species with fixed roles or narrow hierarchies. It also allowed for collaboration with strangers, a key component in long-range exploration and expansion. Surviving global catastrophes. There is also evidence that Homo sapiens weathered extreme environmental events better than their contemporaries. One example is the Toba supervolcano eruption, approximately 74,000 years ago in present-day Indonesia. This eruption was among the largest in the last 2 million years. It may have caused a global volcanic winter with widespread climate disruption and reduced sunlight for years. Many populations, animal and human, collapsed during this period. Yet Homo sapiens survived and rebounded. Why? Not because of luck, but likely due to geographic dispersion and distributed risk. Instead of concentrating in one ecological zone, Homo sapiens had already begun to spread across multiple regions, from Africa to South Asia. This decentralization meant that no single disaster could wipe out the entire species. It also supports the idea that Homo sapiens were not just mobile, but strategically mobile, able to scout, assess, and relocate in response to enviro. The final result, as time passed, the cumulative effects of all these differences began to show. Neanderthals disappeared from Europe around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans faded into genetic memory. Smaller species like Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi vanished, leaving little trace. Homo sapiens, meanwhile, continued to expand into Siberia, into Australia, across the ice to the Americas, and eventually to every continent on Earth. We did not outcompete them in one single domain, but in many domains at once: cognition, communication, cooperation, and contingency planning. Closing reflection. In the end, we were not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor even the most physically resilient, but we were the most adaptable. And adaptability, not brute strength, is what survival demands. The world did not choose us. We simply adjusted faster than the rest. And that made all the difference. Part 5. The Legacy of Migration. a journey still in motion. Every living human today is the product of migration, not metaphorically, but genetically, biologically, and behaviorally. The evidence is embedded in our DNA, in our geographic spread, and in the way we think, move, and respond to change. Migration is not a historical phase. It is an evolutionary mechanism, and for Homo sapiens, it never stopped. Genetic legacy. Each non-African person alive today carries Neanderthal DNA, inherited from encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago in Eurasia. Populations in Southeast Asia and Oceania also carry Denisovan genes, including adaptations for surviving high altitudes, regulating oxygen, and managing immune responses. These fragments are not just leftovers. They are functional legacies of ancient contact embedded in our biology. They reveal that Homo sapiens didn't just move, they interacted, adapted, and integrated with the humans who came before them. We are not purely African, Asian, or European. We are a composite species built on the movement of bodies and the mixing of bloodlines across continents. Climatic versatility migration forced early humans to develop extraordinary environmental adaptability. From humid rainforests to arid deserts, from the freezing tundra of Ice Age Europe to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, Homo sapiens survived in conditions that no single mammal should have tolerated without specialized physiology. But we weren't born for it, we learned it. We invented clothing, shelters, and fire management. We developed strategies for seasonal mobility, resource tracking, and territorial scouting. We adjusted our diets, tools, and group sizes depending on terrain and food availability. This behavioral plasticity is a direct result of our migratory past. No other human species had such a wide ecological range, and that range remains unmatched in the animal kingdom. Instinct to explore. Modern humans are not just capable of migration, we are driven by it. This drive can be seen in how we respond to novelty, how we assess risks, and how we're attracted to the unknown. Even today, human populations display an innate curiosity that correlates with ancestral migration paths. Populations farther from Africa tend to carry genetic variants associated with risk-taking and novelty-seeking behaviors. This suggests a psychological imprint, an ancient reward system that favors exploration, discovery, and movement, because those traits once led to survival. It explains why Homo sapiens kept walking across deserts, mountains, and oceans, even when nothing guaranteed success. The tools of movement. Our ancestors left Africa with no maps, no charts, and no known destination. What they carried instead was strategic mobility. They knew how to follow animal herds. They could detect seasonal changes in vegetation. They formed temporary alliances with other bands to cross dangerous terrain. And when they arrived at a new place, they did not just survive. They settled, transformed, and adapted. Migration was not about escape, it was about opportunity. This behavioral model still defines us. Even in a world of cities, airplanes, and GPS, humans remain deeply migratory. We relocate for resources, climate, safety, or better futures. We build communities in foreign lands. We adapt our identities to fit new environments. What changed is the method, not the motive. Prehistoric global reach. Within a few tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens had reached every habitable continent. 15,000 years ago, humans crossed into the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge. Throughout the Stone Age, humans migrated repeatedly between Africa, Europe, and Asia. In some cases, they crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean using simple watercraft, like bamboo rafts, to reach Australia and the Pacific Islands. These migrations were not random. They followed seasonal wind patterns, celestial navigation, and observations of bird and fish movements. This shows a level of planning and environmental reading unmatched by any other species in prehistory. Migration today, an ancient pattern repeating. Modern migration, though shaped by politics and technology, still reflects ancient behavioral templates. Humans move because they face conflict, climate disruption, famine, and economic collapse, just as their ancestors did. In the 21st century, climate-driven displacement affects millions annually. Wars and instability continue to push people across borders. Urban overcrowding, droughts, and sea level rise force population shifts. These are not new challenges. They are modern versions of ice age droughts, volcanic winters, and shrinking resource zones. The difference is scale, but the instinct remains the same: move to survive. Not a story of conquest, a story of adaptation. The history of Homo sapiens is often told as one of conquest, of mastering lands, defeating other species, and dominating ecosystems. But this view distorts the truth. We did not outmuscle the planet. We adapted to it. We entered new lands cautiously. We responded to failure with flexibility. We combined knowledge across groups to reduce risk. Every migration was an experiment. Some failed, some succeeded. But over time, we learned to survive anywhere. That learning became our legacy. Final reflection. Today, you may live in a building, use satellite navigation, and never walk more than a few kilometers in a day. But your body, your instincts, and your psychology were shaped by movement. The reason we exist is because our ancestors kept walking through deserts, forests, and coastlines, without a destination, without certainty, and often without a way back. They didn't wait for the world to change. They went out and changed how humans lived in the world. We are the descendants of those who dared to leave, without maps, without guarantees, guided only by the possibility of survival.